Hi everyone, my name is Kiran Saidnat and I'm an application engineer for Micrographics. Today we're going to look at AutoCAD and using geometric parametric constraints. Not a lot of people utilize the constraints in AutoCAD, but this can be very beneficial. You'll notice that I've already created a drawing, and most of the times when we create a drawing, something like this for instance, and we notice for instance this part might be not long enough, we'll have to drag everything and move it and use the stretch command, or we might have to, in some instances, delete that specific part and redraw it, and then use our different snap points or override of snaps to place everything in the same orientation. Now, using your constraints can really assist in this manner. When we look at the constraints, I'm just going to use the line command, but to find the constraints, you'll go to the parametric tab. Under your geometric, you'll find the specific constraints. I am drawing just two normal different lines. Now, you'll notice the first constraint we do have is called the coincident constraint. Now, what does the coincident constraint do? This constraint two points to be coincide to a specific point. You can make two specific endpoints coincident, or a line with an endpoint and a midpoint. So if I choose the coincident constraint, you'll notice when I hover over the endpoint, it would form a red circle. That means I'm selecting that as my first point. I'm going to the second line and make that my second point. You'll notice that it almost creates like a blue square, almost like the snap points or the grid points, the grip points. When I click on this, and you'll notice if I move this around, it just changes it to a specific angle. It does not take this away from the bottom point because I made it coincident. If I choose the bottom point and I choose the midpoint, you'll notice the lines are combined, they joined. So it will only make the length or the height for this instance higher. It will increase the height. I'm just going back and just creating another line for instance. When we go to the parametric constraints, you'll notice we've got a vertical constraint. This will make your line vertical. If I choose the vertical constraint and I select this line, you'll notice there's a constraint, a vertical constraint symbol next to it, and that line has been made vertical. Next, I can use the parallel constraints. I can choose this line and that line to make sure they parallel. That means this won't be able to change to a specific angle, for instance, this line over here. And to make sure it stays at a 90-degree angle, I can make the bottom line horizontal. Choosing the horizontal constraint and selecting that bottom line, you'll notice that we've got horizontal and vertical constraints now. When we look at the perpendicular constraint, let's constrain two lines to form a 90-degree angle. Where the coincident, it doesn't have to be a 90-degree angle. It can be coincident to a specific point on a circle, for instance, or radius, specific arcs, for instance. When I choose the perpendicular, you'll notice that as soon as I select this line over here and the bottom line, I'll get an error stating that I'm going to over-constrain it. The big reason why this would happen is because I already used the other constraints. So I already used the specific vertical constraint to make it vertical, and this line is already horizontal. If I use the extend command, you'll notice this already forms a 90-degree angle. For instance, if I choose to create a circle, doesn't matter the circle types, I'm just creating two circles. When I go to the parametric, you'll notice we've got a concentric constraint. If I choose the concentric, it tells me to select the first object. So I'm selecting my first circle and selecting my second circle, and it will allow it and make it concentric towards each other. So you don't have to go and grab it on the snap points and use snap override to make it concentric and move it. You can just use the concentric constraint. Another constraint we do have is the tangent. Before I go to the tangent, you'll notice there's a fix constraint. If I choose the fix constraint, it tells me to select a point. So I want that point to be fixed. That means this point won't be able to move. As you can see, if I drag it, it does not move because that corner is fixed, and this is already on the horizontal constraint. So that means that point is fixed. The same as this line won't be able to move left or right, but it will be able to increase and stretch in height. Now, one of the reasons why I fixed this point is, for instance, if I want to use the tangent constraint, you'll notice that I don't want all my objects to move around from left to right and break the constraints. So it's good if you have something that's placed at a fixed point. Now I'm going to use the tangent constraint. I'm selecting both, or just selecting the first object and selecting the second object, and this line would move tangentially to that circle. I can also use the coincident constraint again, for instance. Select that point, and you'll notice that this circle that's tangent to that line moves with it. So this is a few of the different ways you can use and change your geometrics using your constraints. Notice if I go to the linear dimension, for instance, let's say vertical, I can choose that point and that point. I'll be able to change the size and everything will update accordingly without it breaking your drawing. Changing the dimensions. Because this circle is tangent to this line, everything would update accordingly. We also do have a symmetrical constraint. For instance, if I'm drawing, let's say, just a line there, and I go to the symmetrical constraint, it tells me I need to select the first object or line, so that would be the first line or object, choose the second object. So now what do we want it to be symmetrical to? For example, this line, let's say this should not be on the midpoint and so on. We can put it on the midpoint and we can change the dimensions according to that, but in some cases you will have, for instance, a center line or construction line, and you want it to be symmetrical to that line. We can choose the symmetrical line, and you'll notice that it's symmetrical. For another example is, if I'm going to extend this line, you'll notice that it's exactly on the midpoint of this line and it's perpendicular. You also do get the columnar to show you what that would look like. For instance, let's say you've got a line there and a line there, but you want them to be on the same orientation, the same level, the same axes. You can use the columnar constraint and they'll be lying exactly on the same axis or the same line, and that's an infinite line. Now I'm going to use the coincident constraint again and make that and that coincident, and make this part and this line coincident. You'll notice this line extends automatically. That's good ways of using all the different constraints. Now that I gave you quite a few examples of how you can use the constraints, now with this drawing I do not have any constraints that's active. I can always highlight it and auto-constrain it, and you'll notice that it is constrained automatically. And now I can choose specific dimensions. For instance, let's say linear dimension from that point to that point. If I want to change that to 180, everything will update accordingly without you going and deleting specific lines or redrawing any information. You can also have a horizontal point, so from this point, for instance, and to that point. If I choose that to be, let's say 15, you'll notice that will align. Now I can also choose the vertical constraint and shift right click, choose my quadrant, and I want that to be horizontal with that quadrant over there. And you can play around and see all your different constraints that you can play around with. You'll notice you also do have a smooth. That is, if you create, let's say, two different splines and you want them to smooth in towards each other when they're on the same point. You also do have your different dimensions that you can place, from your linear to your horizontal and your vertical. So for instance, if I make that 100, it would update. And you can choose and play around with as many of these specific points as you would like. And you can change all your dimensions without deleting anything. As you can see, this is out of range, so now I can just go and edit this dimension. Let's say make it 50, and it would update with all the constraints. I hope you guys enjoyed this video of how you can utilize constraints. It does take some practice, but it's a good way to constrain your drawings, and especially if there's any modifications that you would like to do. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe for more.